My goodness, I've been in for a lot of surprises this week. And I think that this is another historic first. It is the first time that I've been introduced at Acadia University by the moderator of the African Baptist Association. And so that I delight in. I want also to say again my appreciation to Acadia, Divinity College, for making all of this possible, and particularly for this day, lifting up the figure of David George and doing just the kinds of things that this program has done during this day. It is an extremely important day in the history of the relationships between the association, the African Baptist Association, Acadia Divinity College, and all the churches in the province and elsewhere represented here. I think that there is nothing more important that can be done than these kinds of structural, programmatic events, because their symbolism is so extremely important. And like all symbols, there is more to this than meets the eye. And so much more can emanate from this particular symbolic event. And so I cannot overly emphasize its importance. How delightful I am to see, or how delightful it is to me, to see so many representatives of the African Baptist Association here tonight, and to have witnessed the particular event that we had during the banquet was a treat in itself. Those of us from the African Baptist Association did not discover this particular preacher, the Reverend Donald Skier, tonight. In my judgment, and I have frequently said that, I think that he is the best evangelical preacher in Canada, black or white. And anyone who has ever heard him would agree. I think that whenever Reverend Skier's name is on the program anywhere in the association, people look forward to that particular event with anticipation. And nobody but nobody has ever been known to fall asleep during his preaching. He is a splendid leader in our churches and in our communities, a model in both respects. And I am just delighted to have him here tonight, as he has been here all day. Now, I have a lecture to do, and I better get on with it. The general task in this lecture series has been that of looking at the structure of meaning in the African traditional context, and how that structure of meaning for the Africans on the continent was affected by the conditions of slavery in the diaspora. And so we began by looking at the African understanding of God, and then how that was affected in the slave condition. And last evening we looked at the African conception of community and how it was affected by the conditions of slavery. And today, similarly, we are going to look at the family. All of these are integrally related in the African worldview. And so if you notice overlap, it is because it's been extremely difficult to keep these subjects neatly separated from one another, because to talk about God implies community, family, and the person, and to talk about any one of those implies the others. And so there's bound to be some overlap, even as there will be tonight. In traditional African societies, the institution of kingship represented the authoritative, moral, political, and religious center of the community. As a matter of fact, the king was the connecting link between the tribe and the world of the spirits, and was dedicated to the service of the community's good by maintaining ritual faithfulness at the altars of the tribal ancestors and divinities. The king's role and function in the tribal community modeled that of the father in the family context. Like the king, the father also bore significant responsibilities for the faithful and proper performance of the family's spiritual, economic, and social obligations. As the king was the intermediary between the tribal community and the spiritual realm, so the father mediated between the family and its ancestral spirits. Mbiti sets forth a vivid summary of this moral hierarchy in the following quotation. And he says, in human relationships, there is emphasis on the concept of hierarchy, based partly on age and partly on status. In practice, this amounts to a ladder ranging from God to the youngest child. God is the creator and hence the parent of mankind, and holds the highest position so that he is the final point of reference and appeal. Beneath God are the divinities and the ancestral spirits, which are more powerful than humans, and some of which were founders and forefathers of different societies. Next come the living dead, the more important ones being those who were full human beings by virtue of going through the initiation rites, getting married, and raising children. And among human beings, the hierarchy includes kings, rulers, rainmakers, priests, diviners, medicine men, elders in each household, parents, father and mother, older brothers and sisters, and finally, the youngest member of the community. Authority is recognized as increasing from the youngest child to the highest being. As for the individual, the highest authority is the community, of which he is a corporate member. So from the youngest child in the family up through the rulers and the king of the tribal group, to the ancestors and the divinities and God, there is this ladder of unity. As with the tribe itself, the family's roots lie in the paramount ancestor, who is believed to take an active interest in the family's well-being. Obviously, the ancestor has enormous powers, since he is no longer limited by the conditions of mortality. Dr. Idowu describes the function of the family ancestor very well. He says the ancestor is believed to take an active interest in the family or community, and his power over it is now considerably increased as he is no longer restricted by earthly conditions. Matters affecting the family or the community are thus referred to him for sanction or judgment. Therefore, he is naturally brought into the picture as a superintending spirit who gives approval to any proposals or actions which make for the well-being of the community and shows displeasure at anything which may tend to disrupt the community. Thus, in a sense, but only in that sense, he is concerned with the effective discharge of moral obligations. I would say that it's probably rather rare if an African student should decide to study abroad and not have gone through some kind of ritual in order to make sure that the ancestral spirit approves of his or her going abroad to study. I would think that that would be very, very rare, even in our day. Hierarchical patterns characterize all African relationships, from the realm of the spirits through the royal court to all social institutions, including the family. In each sphere, harmony of relationships constitutes the nature of the good that is desired by all. Harmony within hierarchy is achieved only by each actor knowing his or her status, functions, and responsibilities in the scheme of things, and above all, avoiding any form of insubordination. Thus, unquestioned loyalty and obedience to legitimate authority are taken for granted virtues. At every level, from that of kingship to sibling rivalry, many checks and balances are present to ensure justice. As with all hierarchical orders, however, the effectiveness of appeals are minimal because the biases of the appellate system tend to favor those in authority. Perhaps the major deterrent to injustice is the knowledge that one's wrong acts can anger the spirits and thereby bring disaster to oneself and or the entire community. It is an understatement to say that kinship, that's K-I-N this time, without the G, constitutes one of the strongest forces in traditional African life. Mbiti says of it, kinship is reckoned through blood and betrothal, that is, engagement and marriage. It is kinship which controls social relationships between people in a given community. It governs marital customs and regulations. It determines the behavior of one individual toward another. Indeed, this sense of kinship binds together the entire life of the tribe and is even extended to cover animals, plants, and non-living objects through the totemic system, that is totems, because each family often has a totem as well. Almost all the concepts connected with human relationship can be understood and interpreted through the family system. Thus this it is which largely governs the behavior, thinking, and the whole life of the individual. Now, some think that kinship constitutes the whole of African tribal community, since all the people within a tribal group are believed to be descended from a common ancestor who long ago lived in their territory, married, produced children, and now lives on in the spirit world. Suffice it to say, however, that in traditional African villages, everyone seems to be related as kin to everyone else. Yet these same societies take the greatest precaution in avoiding incest, which is one of the greatest taboos. All elderly women were called mother, and similarly, elderly men are all called father. When I went back to Nigeria 5 years ago and had not been there for several years, now with gray in my hair, I was immediately reminded of the gray in my hair as over and over again people referred to me in Yoruba land as Baba, which means father. And then you no longer say Mr. or you never call father first name. It's always Baba. And that means you have been now elevated to a much higher status of importance. People older than oneself, but still of childbearing age, were often called uncle or aunt. People closer to one's own age were called elder or younger brother or sister, whichever the case might be. See, often in traditional families, a younger brother will not call the older brother by his first name, and so forth. Once those kinship relationships were established, the persons would refer to one another thenceforth by the kinship term, which implied acceptance of all the corresponding behaviors as prescribed by tradition. Thus, most persons literally had hundreds of fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, brothers, and sisters, and the village functioned as one large family. This, well, good. Somebody is saying amen. And it happens to be somebody from Africa, I'm sure. Yes. This pattern continues up to the present day, not only in villages, but also amongst friends and associates in urban centers. I have had the happy experience of being incorporated into family structures similarly. Africans in the diaspora often exhibit a similar way of relating to one another, especially in small towns and frequently in the churches, where reverence for others, or as brother and sister, is often commonplace. In many African American churches and African Canadian churches, the practice of elevating elderly women to the status of church mother is a most revered one, and it has not been uncommon for pastors to be called father. And in fact, in the historical text, stories about Richard Preston and David George, one will discover that their congregations referred to them as Father Preston and Father George. In fact, the founder of the, well, I just said that. The African family is invariably very large as compared with Western families. It includes not only all the extended relatives, which in a polygamous situation can easily number in the thousands, but also the ancestors, who are considered an integral part of the family unit. You see, it's very problematic if you ask an African, how is your family? Well, they will be baffled at first until they become acclimated to our situation here. And normally we're referring to, how is your wife or husband and children, immediate children. But the African has to do a mental check on that and to see whether you're referring to the very small part of his or her family, or whether you really do want to know about the entire family. And then you better be prepared to sit down for a full day. Hence, families make offerings of food and libation to the living dead because they are still a vital part of the family and they function as the family's spiritual protectors. The food and libation so offered are tokens of the fellowship, communion, remembrance, respect, and hospitality being extended to those who are the immediate pillars or roots of the family. The living dead solidify and mystically bind together the entire family. Africans take care in teaching their children their genealogies of descent in order to instill in them a profound sense of belonging and a deep pride in their heritage, both of which aid in inculcating in them the sacred obligation to extend the family line. The African family includes not only the living and the spiritual ancestors, but also those who are not yet born, those whom Mbiti says are still in the loins of the living. Thus, in preparation for the unborn to become born, parents participate fully in marriage arrangements in order to extend the family and to enable the unborn to see the light of day. In the African context, marriages are family and community affairs, and as such, parents play the principal role in all the negotiations related to it. In traditional societies, the man and woman have very little to say in the matter. In modern times, they participate more fully, yet they leave much of the process in the hands of their parents, not only because of their great respect for the wisdom of age and experience, but also because African marriages are much more than the union of two individuals. Fundamentally, marriage is the union of two families that is contractually binding for the indefinite future. And so that serves as a tremendous resource of strength to the family, because it's not just a matter of two individuals. It is fundamentally a matter of two families. And in the case of divorce or anything like that, it has to be arranged by the two families. And that makes things much more complicated and complex. In fact, the act of marrying is one of the most sacred activities in life for the African. Let me quote Mbiti again. For African peoples, marriage is the focus of existence. It is the point where all the members of a given community meet, the departed, the living, and those yet to be born. They are all present, really present, and involved. All the dimensions of time meet here, and the whole drama of history is repeated, renewed, and revitalized. Marriage is a duty, a requirement from the corporate society, and a rhythm of life in which everyone must participate. Otherwise, he who does not participate in it is a curse to the community. He is a rebel and a lawbreaker. He is not only abnormal, but underhuman. Failure to get married under normal circumstances means that the person concerned has rejected society, and society rejects him in return. Now, there are many problems associated with that. This is the norm, and it is an it's a major problem of immense proportions when a person does not marry, and if they marry, if they do not produce children. Marriage is integrally tied up with the whole cosmological scheme. As we have seen before, the living dead continue life in the spiritual realm as long as they have descendants who remember them and pour out libations to them. When that memory terminates, it can be rightly said that the departed one has fully died. And thus, Mbiti says, a person who therefore has no descendants, in effect quenches the fire of life and becomes forever dead, since his line of physical continuation is blocked if he does not get married and bear children. End of quotations. Mbiti, unfortunately, did not use sex-inclusive language, and so whenever I'm not using sex-inclusive language, you can be sure I'm quoting somebody. In addition to marriage, the events of birth, naming ceremonies, puberty ceremonies, and death all bind together the spiritual and the historical realms of existence. Appropriate ceremonies and rituals must be performed in each instance in order to preserve harmony throughout the community. The hierarchical structure of the African family is based on age, and authority is distributed accordingly. That is to say, the eldest living member of the family is the highest authority. He or she is closest to the ancestors, having known them while they were still alive, and therefore having a closer contact. It's much like, well, the Africans understand this very much, at the end of, well, after the resurrection, when the early church asked the question of who were rightly apostles. And those who had known Jesus in the flesh had greater spiritual authority than those who had not known him in the flesh. And that was the problem that Paul had, of course, who had not known him in the flesh, and then trying to establish his apostolicity. This is a similar thing in terms of the eldest members in the family who have known the ancestors in the flesh. And that guarantees their authority in the family. African children are taught from their earliest days to respect all their elders and to give the highest honor to the eldest of all. Unlike the Western world, one feels no diminution of status in Africa by virtue of growing old. On the contrary, one's social status increases with age, since there is no such thing as the nuclear family. Divorced from the extended family, parents feel no shame or embarrassment in being cared for by their children, nor do the children feel any embarrassment or feel that this is in any way an imposition on them. Even among children, it is the duty of the older ones to assume responsibility for the younger ones, and for neither to be found wanting in carrying out their respective duties and obligations toward one another. Although there is no equality among age groups, each person is brought up significantly related to his or her age group. That is, within an age group, that's where you find your equality and your equal status. And everybody is in an age group. But there's no equality between an older age group and a younger age group. That's the point I'm trying to make. Although there is no equality among age groups, each person is brought up significantly related to his own. I've repeated that sentence. Only in that context does the individual experience equality. But the inequality of hierarchy does not imply injustice as long as trust exists among those who interact with one another, and as long as all share a common dedication to the paramount value of maintaining harmony within the community. Now, it needs to be stated here that Africans in the diaspora continue to display a high level of respect for their elders, and even among children, the younger ones are taught to obey the older ones. One of the clearest examples of their respect for age differential is seen with the ascendancy of the eldest child as the titular head of the family following the death of the parents. Their newly acquired place of authority is never contested within the family. The ethical systems of Africans tend to be covenantal. That is to say, all relations between persons and with the spiritual realm are covenantal in nature. The relationships are reciprocal in that each party is bound to the other by bilateral obligations. In all their relationships, Africans assume a reciprocity of responsibilities and duties, determined in large part by traditional understandings, beliefs, and practices. Such responsibilities and duties were exercised within a context that bestowed primary value on activities of constituting, reconstituting, preserving, and enhancing community, which in turn constituted, reconstituted, preserved, and enhanced the lives of all. Like all principles of action, this principle of reciprocity was not abstracted from the concrete relationship. Being relative to the relation itself, the principle could not be set in motion apart from an accurate assessment of the status of each person in the relationship. More specifically, when two persons of the same tribal group meet, it is necessary for them to converse with one another in order to determine who is the senior and who is the junior. That's very important. The answer to that question defines the relationship and determines who should take the initiative in relationship to the other. Once that question has been settled, then the corresponding responsibilities and duties are clear. Being of higher or lower status was not a pejorative judgment, but an empirical fact, which in many cases was invariable, unchangeable. This structure pertained in both primary and secondary associations. For example, age was and continues to be a natural principle of differentiation among African peoples. That is, in the order of social status, elderly persons were prior to younger people. And similarly, older siblings had a place of primacy over the younger ones, and male siblings over females, another problematic area. Thus, persons of higher status in a relationship could initiate action towards persons of lower status, but never the other way around. If the latter, that is the person of lower status, wished to approach the person of higher status, he or she would need the help of a mediator. That is, someone of higher status than the one to be approached. And so, if you really want to approach your father on a very serious matter, you do not go directly to your father, but rather you go to your father's older brother. And then the older brother intercedes on your behalf, and usually it's very effective. That is, further, it was assumed not only that the person of higher social status would be the initiator of action towards the other, but it was also assumed that the other would always act responsibly. That is, in such a way as to ensure communal harmony. Thus, in the African context, it was assumed that all actions by persons of higher social status towards those of lower status were justified, since it was thought that wrongdoing could not originate from the top and only from below. And this is true of all hierarchical structures. Just look at the military, for instance. Wrong, it's very difficult to demonstrate that wrong starts at the top. It may, but it's very difficult to prove that within that system. Family disputes were settled in much the same fashion as disputes were settled elsewhere in the tribal community. Some person in authority would adjudicate the case after hearing both sides of the dispute and then render a decision. Under such circumstances, the decision was rarely questioned because the questioning itself would imply an attack on the moral integrity of the judge. The principle of reciprocity, operative in all African relationships, pertain primarily to the relations between persons and only secondarily to the possible objects of exchange. That is, in a business encounter. This is seen most clearly in the traditional African marketplace, which has always required immense amount of time to effect a sale, since the issue at stake was never solely the buying and selling of commodities, abstracted from the relationship between the buyer and the seller. Rather, serious bargaining either constituted or reconstituted a relationship between the buyer and the seller. Its aim was always to effect an outcome that would be pleasing to both and ensuring an ongoing relationship between the two persons. And so when you are bargaining, there's much more going on than just the price of these goods. But it's important to establish a personal relationship. And when that is established, then of course neither is going to harm the other because of their mutual commitment to the furtherance of community. Africans express their goodwill through the giving of gifts. Almost any encounter may present such an occasion, and anyone who's gone to Africa knows that to be a fact. Yet Africans feel under no moral obligation, however, to extend their benevolence to people outside their communal context. Whenever they choose to do so, that is to act benevolently towards those outside, they must first of all grant a kind of honorary family status to the outsider. And once you've been granted that honorary status, then everything else follows, and you're treated just like a member of the family. For example, traditionally, the Yorubas in Nigeria express this desire in the form of a welcoming ceremony, which centered around the breaking and sharing of the kola nut. The host would break the kola nut and pass it around to those assembled, each of whom would take a piece. And after all had been served, they would eat it together. The act of eating together signified goodwill on the part of all and a sign of harmony. With the context so defined, the relationship could proceed accordingly. Some say that the guest is virtually made an honorary member of the family, and depending upon his or her status elsewhere, assumes similar status in that context. And I'm sure that the principal of Acadia Divinity College, when he goes to Nigeria, and as soon as it is known that he is principal of a college, then that status follows him into that context, and his treatment is enhanced all the more. This welcoming ritual of goodwill is extended more intensely during the common meal, where everyone present eats from a common dish. And not always does one have that experience, but it's only when you've been around for a very long while and the family really does feel that you have really grown very close to them, that then you can eat with your hands in the common dish, and you can dispense with the Western utensils of knife and fork and so forth. It is an understatement to say that the experience of slavery had a devastating effect on the consciousness of all Africans in the diaspora. The conditions of bondage not only uprooted them from their family surroundings, that is, the comforting experience of community and family belonging, the ubiquitous guidance of traditional rituals, festivals, and ceremonies, the habitual practice of obligatory participation, but they severed them permanently from the specificity of tribal community and family cohesion. As we have seen, the culture of the slaves gradually constructed a substitute for their former community. But the conditions of slavery effectively prevented the development of family life. In large part, this was due to the nullification of family structures by the slave system. Viewed and treated as property, slaves were afforded none of the societal structures that contributed to the development of self-determining human beings with dignity and respect. Rather, their entire life was proscribed by the dictates and interests of their slave owners. Marriages were often disallowed, for the most part disallowed, and even if permitted, husbands and wives had no spheres of jurisdiction, conjugal or otherwise. Both were the legal property of their owners, as also were their children, and as such, their owners could do with them as they pleased, and they did. Accordingly, if allowed to live together, their life in the slave quarters was respected no more than that of other livestock. Either they themselves or their children could be sold without notice, brutally beat, sexually assaulted, or even killed at any time. Their lives were completely controlled by the arbitrary whims and desires of their owners. The intensity and scope of the horror is almost inconceivable. When the slaves met, and they would say to one another at the end that if we do not meet anymore in this life, then we will meet in heaven, that was not a futuristic thought that we normally have, because we normally think almost for sure that we are going to be around tomorrow and the next day and the next week. The slave could never have that kind of assurance. Future was very, very limited. Yet in the concealed spaces of their lives, the slaves found ways to preserve their sense of family value. E. Franklin Frazier, sociologist, a black sociologist, rightly pointed out before his untimely death in the early 60s that a paramount value in the slave experience was namely the permanency of the bond between the mother and her children, a bond that is not subject to the impact of external conditions, regardless how inimical to family life they might have been. Consequently, under all conditions of slavery, he says, the Negro mother remained the most dependable and important figure in the family. End of quote. Further, Frazier cites considerable evidence to prove that slave mothers developed a deep and permanent love for their children, which often caused them to defy their masters and to undergo suffering to prevent separation from their young. The reverence that the slaves had for motherhood and their longing for reunion with their respective mothers is clearly revealed in their spirituals. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to be with God. Heaven was often seen as home, and heaven was often seen as Africa. Many of the slaves believed that when they would die, their spirits would then float across the oceans to join the ancestral realm in Africa, which was home. But part of that song is also, I want to meet my mother, I want to meet my mother, I want to meet my mother, I'm going to live with God. Similarly, the slaves added verses which included references to their brothers and sisters, thus viewing heaven as a family reunion, often thought of to take place on African soil. In this type of family imagery, we see the slave's imagination drawing upon the African view of the spiritual home of the family ancestors and incorporating it into the Christian view of heaven. And similarly, as with many other spirituals, we discover the slave's longing to meet his or her mother. Going to meet my dear old mother down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Going to meet my dear old mother down by the riverside, going to study war no more. And finally, no other spiritual evokes greater pathos than the imagery of separation from mother and home. Sometimes I feels like a motherless child a long ways from home. Thus, African slaves devised many and various ways to preserve the moral and spiritual experience of family cohesion. Under the conditions of forced separation from family members, They struggled relentlessly to keep alive the memories they had of the association, and they did so in much the same way as their forebears in Africa preserved the memory of their ancestors. The memory itself constituted the reality and was a source of hope and renewed life. Thus, it is not surprising that slave literature is replete with longings, with memories of and longings for home, family, the foundational experiences of trustworthy association, emotional security, and moral development. Clearly, many social scientists have focused their attention on the impact of slavery on the African family. Accordingly, they have analyzed the various types of families produced by the conditions of bondage, racial discrimination, economic deprivation, and similar conditioning factors. Not surprisingly, these have concluded that the vast number of such families, that is, those of the middle and the proletariat classes, exhibit many pathological characteristics in one way or another. All of these analysts, including E. Franklin Frazier, assumed that the standard for healthy family life was set by the white upper classes. And that is one of the major faults in the work of so many of the black sociologists, because they were trained in departments of, or in disciplines that were controlled by white theorists. And their white theorists, the white theorists, were influenced by their own cultural biases that found their ways into those theories. And so one of the biases was that the healthy, wholesome family was the upper class white family. That's one of the reasons, unfortunately, that we often refer to the very wealthy people as being the good families. And we say that somebody comes from a good family. Strange use of terms. But moral virtue was bestowed upon those families simply because of their acquisition of material objects. Now, in this respect, the black upper class was not only differentiated from the masses by economic factors, but had largely assimilated the basic values of the white race. And that is the sociology of black communities in the turn of this century, and where you would discover something like a black upper class. Then you would discover that they had assimilated the values of the white upper class. And that made for a lot of difficulties in many ways, both within the race and otherwise. According to Frazier, the primary characteristics of these upper class families were, that is, upper class black families, were their mixed blood, their uncritical appreciation for the cultural style of whites, their disdain for the lower classes, and their high regard for patriarchal governance within the family. Now, with respect to the latter, Frazier argues that it was not unusual, that is, with respect to the patriarchy, getting into a whole historical, sociological area of great problems here. One of the reasons why we need more young black students to come along, go into graduate studies, do dissertations on some of these subjects in order to help us out. I can only point to the problems. Or some of the problems, not all the problems. With respect to the patriarchal family structure, Fraser argues that it was not unusual for the black husband to purchase his wife from slavery and then refuse to emancipate her. We often don't really recognize that that did happen. We think and hear about the stories of the men working for many years sometimes in order to get enough money to purchase their wives out of slavery. But then we don't say, well, then what happened after that? Did they emancipate the women? Well, that's a question. By not emancipating her, he was able to secure his rule over her and the children, and thus become a model family man, which had not been possible under the conditions of slavery. Because the model family man, you see, was to be in control. The only way for an ex-slave man to get in control of these black women who had been independent all along, so to speak, was to try to keep her in bondage. I'm not sure how widespread this was, but it did happen. Interestingly, Fraser develops this argument to demonstrate how changing economic conditions following slavery gradually enabled the husband to gain ascendancy over matriarchal rule in the family. And during slavery, he had been denied a place of authority in the family. His new status was a product of his economic standing, that is to say, male authority over the family, and interest in it were not dissimilar from the control and interest any owner has in his or her property. Now, that's Fraser's analysis of the black family, and there are a lot of problems with it. His analysis is the antithesis of my analysis. Because my argument is that the African slave was not a tabula rasa, shaped merely by the economic and social forces in this world, on this continent. Contrary to Fraser's analysis, I contend that in preserving their humanity under the most threatening conditions imaginable, the African slaves preserved in their consciousness the most fundamental values of family life, namely the natural cohesion of family relatives, the undying presence of maternal bonding, deep respect for the practical wisdom of the elderly, as well as their power to bless and to curse, deference of the younger to the older siblings, and the responsibility of the older for the younger, unquestioned obedience to parental authority, whether patriarchal or matriarchal, belief in life after death, and the reunion of the entire family with God in the spiritual world. All of these values were deeply rooted in traditional African culture. The conditions of bondage did not erase them from the consciousness of the slaves, and their reality among Africans in the diaspora are not the products of economic and social forces, nor were they gained by imitating their white exemplars. Rather, these values were indelibly etched on the minds of all African peoples, and like the natural force of maternal bonding, they have been inviolable in the race. Further, all of these values have been nurtured and cherished by the churches of African peoples. No other family event is more significant among African peoples in the diaspora than funerals. Everyone desires a large, stately funeral, and to that end, even the poorest person maintains a life insurance policy in order to pay for his or her funeral. In the early days, the churches played an important role in burial arrangements, often helping their members to bear the expenses. Then and now, the entire community rallies around the bereft family on the occasion of death, providing food, shelter, transportation, assistance with household chores, and any other helpful expression of their sympathy. In brief, funerals are just not only family affairs. They are community events of great importance. Not only do they remind everyone of their own mortality, but they are enshrouded in mystery. Further, many, if not most, believe that the recently deceased one has peculiar powers which can be used for their benefit or for their discomfort, depending upon the rightness of their actions and thoughts towards the deceased. During slavery and thereafter, many objects of value were buried with the deceased, and family members had to stay in mourning for extended periods of time, which meant that they had to wear black clothing and participate in no merriment throughout the specified period. I can remember when I was a child, immediate members of your family, when they die, you were in mourning for at least 6 months, and it would be most irreverent if you sort of went out and did entertaining type things during that period. Interestingly, all of these viewpoints and practices are strikingly similar to those in traditional African culture, and moreover, they are all widely adhered to in our day, both in Africa and in the African diaspora. I'm rapidly coming to an end. W.E.B. Du Bois once wrote that because of slavery, the black churches in America antedated the black family. That fact placed an ominous responsibility upon them, in that they were forced, that is the churches, were forced to become surrogate families for their members. Because there were churches before there were families. The importance of this cannot be overestimated. The pastor is the patriarchal head who is expected to direct the spiritual life of the members through preaching and instruction. He is expected to govern the whole body firmly and justly. He is expected to be an exemplar of the faith and often viewed as the model father and husband. He embodies the community's most basic moral and spiritual values and participates with the community in all of its sorrows and triumphs, both within the church and without. Most of all, he intercedes on their behalf to God. Traditionally, he has also been the chief intermediary between the black community and the white power structures. His patriarchal authority transmits a feeling of security to those who are constantly rendered insecure by the threatening conditions surrounding their lives. Hence, they have great difficulty in even considering the transference of pastoral authority to women. And this is a major problem and difficulty. As with all patriarchal positions, the members do not share equality with their clergy, and this is evidenced in all their personal encounters with the clergy. Faithful stewardship, loyal devotion, and responsible obedience are the virtues of the laity. Correspondingly, integrity of character, dependable service, and the just exercise of authority are the virtues of the clergy. Contrary to what is generally thought about patriarchs, the personalities of these clergy are not characterized by harsh severity, but rather by warm, friendly amiability. As a consequence, the clergy tend to exercise their authority in indirect ways. Their clerical titles of reverend, pastor, etc., and their liturgical functions make their status unmistakably clear to all. In short, this gentle, respectful authority pleasantly contrasts with the insensitive, disrespectful authorities the people encounter daily in their dealings with white people. Apart from the warmth of the relationship, this style of leadership is strikingly similar to that in traditional African societies and in contemporary African churches. In addition to the pastor as a surrogate father, many churches bestow honorable status on older women who are considered to be church mothers. These usually give leadership in the women's societies of the church. These are independent women's spaces within the churches, autonomously governed and controlled by the women, who are the most significant financial resources in all of the churches. Much study needs to be done of these women's associations. And in the United States, happily, I have a couple of women students, black women, in the PhD programs who are doing dissertations on nothing other than the women's auxiliaries and the women's missionary societies and the women's institutes and conventions in order to see just what has been going on in those independently controlled spaces where the pastors don't even go unless they are invited. Further, women constitute the spiritual pulse of the laity and can be relied upon in their faithfulness at prayer meetings, Bible study, regular worship services, and in their tithings and offerings. Many are viewed as embodying all the marks of saintliness and are rightly referred to as the pillars of the church. It is also a tradition, finally, wherein church members refer to one another as brothers and sisters because they view the church as an extended family that rightly assumes responsibility for all of its members. And consequently, the church's ministry has always been a holistic ministry, serving all of the needs of the people. All of the real needs of the people are rightly part and parcel of the ministry of the church. In this respect, the churches have been a surrogate family. So the African family that was lost in many ways was reconstituted in very similar ways by the Africans in the diaspora in their churches. And you have been once again, very attentive, and I appreciate that very much.